Okay, so I really have been thinking about some things that's happened at work this week. Not really happened, well, yeah, happened. Not to me, not around me, just some things I've heard about. And, I've been thinking generally anyway of posting something kind of summative about what the structure of the institutional church has kind of gotten wrong and why it's been problematic. And it seems like this is a good time. Thinking about how at work I've met four people who have been openly professing Christians out of the, dozens of people who I've met there, staff members I've met there. It's not that there aren't more, but there's four that have, I don't know, come out, I suppose, been comfortable enough to talk about it. One I don't know much about. One I know, well, don't really know anything personally about any of them. I just know kind of stuff that has happened with them at work and work ethic and that kind of thing. One, don't really know anything. One, don't know a whole lot. Kind of poor examples of work ethic, but not much in the way of detail. One is pretty consistently known for how almost resolute she is in not doing her job, but she's very good at ingratiating herself with management and making herself on paper irreplaceable, and making the place a lot of money. So there's just no question in she kind of gets immunity for that reason. And this one in particular also is known to do some really not great things, like conspiring with clients to steal from the company and other not great things. And then this week, a manager who has been there for 20 plus years, there has been some, well, he's currently on leave for being essentially predatory towards some of the half his age female staff. And, this one, of course, has me thinking about, well, he's been there for so long, this has happened before, it's going to get shoved under the rug and keep happening, if it has happened at all. It has happened consistently. This is how this goes. And, so it's not like any of these pictures are particularly great or savory, to say the least. And, what's kind of the time-old narrative that people who leave the church leave because of how people in the church are. And sort of the more influential the people in the church are, typically, it seems like, the more worked into this narrative of others leaving the church and leaving Christianity and leaving God, the more influential these people are. Now, it's not that this is every time, of course. People leave for plenty of reasons. And sometimes it's just that they don't like somebody, or they got in a fight with someone, or there were rumors, right? But there's usually some level of abuse and hypocrisy going on, not just by Christians generally, but with those who tend to stick around and have positions of influence. I think it's probably on the rarer side that people will leave churches, denominations, even Christianity as a whole, just because of what other by the numbers, occasional or maybe consistent attendees of a church do. It's always or almost always some form of leadership, or at the very least, highly socially influential people. Which on the one hand is precisely what Jesus came to address. Why he had to incarnate, because his leadership of his people were so radically good at what they did on the one hand, but what they did was radically harmful and driving people away from God and the knowledge of God. And now, is not like it was then. Now is not, in the sense that back then, all information was very strictly kind of gate kept and just not readily available to people. Now it is, but this idea of, or not this idea, but this sort of setup of religious leadership driving wedges between other people and God is still very much in effect. And not just, seldom instances, but the whole structure of, like the sort of gatekeepy, exclusive, top-down structure of the way that the institutional church has formed over the years, centuries, and the way it presents itself today. And of course I've talked about how, now that there are different avenues of information, and information broadly is so much more available, and trains of thought and lines of questioning, is not just who you grow up around and what culture you're a part of, but now everyone has access to everything. So the kind of narrow views that you're taught are no longer constricting you to a certain assumed, singular option for what rightness or righteousness is supposed to look like. And what I was thinking more specifically about how things I've talked about before, was this kind of idea of eternal security, and all you have to do is do this easy, give up pseudo-repentant thing one time, and now you're saved forever, and basically you can do whatever you want, and if you line up the way people think you should, then you really were saved, but if you wind up different, then you really weren't, but who knows, because bait and switch, because, social majority and the people you're around are the ones defining what saved even looks like, and all this other stuff. But more than that, I think, so on the one hand, if you just, look broad strokes, right? Christians demographically as a whole, if you just define them by people who profess to be Christians, in polls, on paper, people who have some regularity of church attendance, whatever, are going to be exactly the same as everyone else. And that's part of the unfortunate result of how far church structure and teaching has strayed from what Jesus built and intended for his people, and currently intends. That aside from a bit of a cultural sort of umbrella, there is no real difference across the board. There's no visual difference, there's no behavioral difference, but in a way, there kind of is too, but it's not a good one. Because when you get into this body of teaching and acting and meeting and gathering and being, that on the one hand kind of posits this divinely impugned righteousness and rightness and, eternal life and eternal salvation and security and all this stuff, and you essentially don't have to do anything to get it. You don't have to give up anything. You don't even have to really think much about it. And in fact, how sermons and church cultures present themselves typically is don't think. Others will have and do have the answers for you. They won't perhaps say this sometimes. A lot of times they will, which is horrifying that it's a thing. But it becomes radically easy and appealing for, in a sense, the lowest of the moral character of people to gravitate towards this and to settle in this. Because, of course, why would you not want to feel like you're the most right, more right than anyone who's ever existed, and more righteous than anyone else has ever existed, and you don't have to give up anything or do anything with it or for it? And then at the same time, in kind of this broader cultural club perspective, we get to be better than everyone else because of where we are, because of who we associate with, because of this label that we put on ourselves. Right? How often we see almost, I'm sure it's not ubiquitous, but it's so common to see in church gatherings this teaching where Jesus says, 2 or 3 gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst of them. And we have tens, hundreds, thousands in attendance, and we just sort of use this label of, well, Jesus is somewhere in the idea of the theology of the name of the sign on the street, must be here now. And yeah, all of this is just such a radically high level of assumptiveness in all of this. And then from that, you have this massive chasm that is left for people to do and say and act and treat others essentially however they want at their basis level, and feel protected because of this sort of ostensible superficial shield that the cultural church has created for them and around them. And I think this is why this combination of things, of the proclaimed righteousness, self-righteousness on the one hand, and this kind of drawing in, this magnetism of kind of the morally perverse, or towards the morally perverse on the other hand, is why we see so much, not just rife abuses throughout the church generally, but why the sense of hypocrisy and cruelty and superficiality is so strong that comes from the church and church culture. And that's kind of what I've been reflecting on with the things that have been happening at work, because they just continue to happen, right? These abuses continue to happen, and we see them from the same people and the same leaders over and over and over again, the same types of leaders and groups and circles, just on repeat indefinitely. And really, I think this goes all the way back to 1 John 4, where where John in this epistle talks about the spirit of Antichrist and how it has already gone out into the world. And where this idea of Antichrist is not just against Christ, as we think of it, the word anti in the modern sense, but it's really a replacement or substitute Christ. And so the Western church culture and the sort of capitalistic idea and this Enlightenment idea and all these things that have worked into what the church is institutionally now, all is very much home for this spirit of Antichrist. And mind you, it's not to say that everyone who goes to church is evil and buys into this stuff, or every church or denomination is absolutely, or as a whole, by its nature corrupt or anything like that. But we as humans are by our nature corrupt. And because these are human-defined places and groups that kind of ham-fist theology to kind of protect our egos at the same time, the corruption tends to gather, and 2, stagnate and rot. And this is exactly what we see from the church body as a whole, that on the one hand, those of you who are familiar with church and church culture at some point, some level, probably realize this hyper-focus on evangelism, bringing in more people, saving more, whatever. But it's a body that is diseased and dead on the inside, and it's like only the limbs are still working, only the mouth is kind of still working, but who knows what it's saying. And the rest is just neglected and not fed and gone. And this, now that people are not just on the fingertips anymore, but really in the meat of the whole thing, this is why people are leaving. And I think, across the board, rightly so. Um, Now, there's certainly a huge question as to, why each person or group or family might leave. Um, what could we have done better, not in a particular situation, but rather going from we've been hurt to God doesn't exist. I think it's very rarely a logical conclusion in terms, or even a logical question, right? Certainly there are many times that someone is in a relationship with God or feels like they are, and the abuses from the church and from its ostensible people are so great and you just don't know how to deal with it. But typically those people are examining things more thoroughly and will end up coming back to it in some way. And I think to some extent this is going to be this. It's just a mark of maturity in people from any group or certainly any belief system. So that's not really here nor there. And this is all kind of why I wanted to look at this passage that has been hackneyed and talked about so much in churches, but is always, always, always applied, at least primarily applied to people. This is kind of us versus them, people in the church versus people outside. Us who in here we can say are saved, are righteous, or whatever, and the others. This is towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, where Jesus says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction. There are many who go in by it. Narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way," or as the footnote says, "how narrow is the way which leads to life. There are few who find it. How confined is that way, and difficult is the way, and there are few who find it." And I heard a pastor say in a sermon, listen to whatever sermons come on the radio all the time, and something I heard pointed out was that, like in this context of most people essentially not being saved, ultimately not like now, in the kind of narrow sense that churches give, right, but ultimately in terms of like eternal salvation. And I wasn't really sure that, I'm still not really sure that that's a thing, because of course he was coming from anyone who hasn't heard the gospel information and then accepted it in these narrow sort of exercises that we in the cultural church have presented arbitrarily as a thing. Everyone that isn't in that is going to be lost, right? So basically everyone in the world, in terms of percentage, is almost everyone, just because of not hearing this information. I'm not going to go through the study of why that's wrong right now, but I think in the picture of the church and church teaching, this is a fantastic picture of what's really happening, what has been happening, because the more people know, the easier, of a time they feel like they have in terms of like theological knowledge and access and rightness and authority. And so that's part of why the way is so broad. The way that leads to destruction is wide as this gate and broad is the way. I think there's another passage that says that it's easy is the way, but don't quote me on that. So why is it broad? Why is it a broad way? Why is the gate wide? Why is it this, like, kind of picture of this just meandering road that leads to this really easy thing to go in by? And it's exactly the things that we've been talking about. That discipleship pastor position that I mentioned last week, that church had a little page on their website talking about salvation, and there was a line in there that said how easy salvation is, that salvation is an incredibly easy thing to, achieve or receive, or whatever their wording was. And this message is exactly contradictory to Jesus's message here, and is also why the church has become such a bastion for moral stagnation, precisely because of this easy and incorrect teaching that salvation is easy, that discipleship is easy, that you don't have to do anything or give up anything or face adversity, and if you do, it's because you're doing it wrong or you haven't done it at all, rather than, as Jesus explicates, to take up your cross and follow me, to take up your implement of torture and anguish and follow me. And, as the word discipling literally means following. If you're not following Jesus, if you're not walking, if you're not progressing, if you're not introspecting, looking into yourself, continually giving up more of yourself, and turning to God and letting Him remake you and make you into a person, and from the lump of flesh that you were, you're not following at all. You're just going through these motions, and we have such a feel-good, superficial skin on churchianity now that it's just such a wonderful place for people to settle. But more than that, it's a wonderful place for privileged people to settle, right? For moneyed people, for people who don't have to face particular suffering or adversity, to kind of sit in this feeling of rightness, go through a whole life, have everything essentially provided, or provided enough that you can go out, you work, you don't have to try too hard, you get basically have your physical needs covered, you have your social needs covered, you feel okay, you can kind of be dramatic about some of the smaller things, make them seem into bigger things, and at the end of the day, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And that's exactly what we see. And that's exactly what's happening here, is that richness in, social, financial, mental, all these other faculties and resources, coupled with this message of, as long as you're here, you're fine. Not just as long as you're here, you're fine. As long as you feel like you're one of us, then you can claim and also feel like you're better than everyone else. And you don't have to do anything. You're good to go for the rest of eternity. All of it works together into this rancid, false body that claims to be the body of Jesus, the body of the humble Savior that became sin for us. But if we're not willing to, and if we don't, follow in those footsteps of radically life-changing humility, then we are not, in fact, following Him at all. And certainly if we're able to point to whether someone is saved or not, you're not. And that should just be a mark for yourself, because it's not a thing that we can say one way or the other. That's what Judgment Day is for. But that's not the message, because the message is, if we're fine now, what else do we have to worry about ever? Why would I have to try? Why would I have to continue to be sanctified? Well, I don't. And yeah, it's all just really frustrating, because on the one hand, it's so easy for abuses to persist. On the other hand, it makes it so easy to just kind of make excuses to leave, to not look harder or more into or at what's going on, to see that there are, in fact, real people committing these sins, these abuses, these wrongs, and claiming that they are right, or claiming that they are rights that they're committing. And then, the common sort of humanism that is today is equally easy. You can feel good about it. You don't have to really try. You can, like, how often do we see, anytime there is anything ostensibly Christian online, and there's almost unquestionably going to be at least a couple of people saying, well, I don't need a book, I don't need a system, I don't need a God to tell me what's right and wrong. But what do you have left? You have yourself, you have what you feel, you have what people around you tell you, and what you're used to, and it can change in a moment, on a day, and who knows and who cares, As long as I feel like it's right, then it's right. Which is essentially the problem that the church has already ingrained into itself. It's just there's a bit of this other layer of we're telling you that it's right, and, it's in doctrinal statements and statements of faith and that kind of thing. So you're just moving from one kind of lane on the broad path to another when you settle that way. And I think that is part of, again, why the institutional church has been so destructive. Because if the way that claims to know God and be God and represent God is so wildly inefficient and insufficient, then why not just go to the opposite, where there's nothing? It's just me and the people I know and the things that I think, and that's the end of it. But what's fascinating too is because of God, how God actually works. How the Holy Spirit works with and through and in everyone, is that those who have genuinely left the church culture because of these abuses, and not just kind of satiate their own, like a different flavor of want for not having to try, essentially, and elevate themselves for whatever reason. Now the Holy Spirit can actually work more with you once you are out of this false body of false Christianity. Now he can work more with you towards pursuing truth and growing in rightness and righteousness and actually following Jesus, even if you don't know that by label. But what you do know of Jesus is so false that, as he is the way, the truth, and the life, the actual way, the actual truth, and the actual life, not just what the church people you've heard have said and represented, you can end up following that anyway. But when you don't have the information of that, you don't have the kind of intellection of actively trying to, search yourself and repent and allow yourself to be transformed, then I think it becomes, in a sense, much more difficult to actually do that. Now, that doesn't mean that becomes more difficult to be saved, right? Because at the end of the day, man looks at the physical, the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Say 1 Samuel 16:7. And that's how everyone is going to be ultimately judged, is by their heart and how they have given into, have humbled themselves before God, before rightness and righteousness, or have not, regardless of context, regardless of culture, regardless of knowledge or information or anything else. And, church culture has been so wildly effective at pumping so much information that is tangential to and about God into people, that I think it becomes so much more difficult to humble yourself in that context, because you feel like and have been told that you already have, just by acquiescence or by adjacence to this knowledge. And it's very much not how that works. I think there's Paul talks about, and I'm not going to try to look it up right now. Those who know more are essentially judged harsher, especially teachers in the church, precisely for these reasons, because we have such a higher calling with this information, this realization, this knowledge and truth, to bring people to the real Christ, and not the idea of us where we can feel safe and comfortable and self-righteous. I could go on forever. It's just, especially politically now, what we see happening, with kind of how radical the loudest conservatives are becoming, older conservatives are becoming, just in this category of self-rightness and self-righteousness, and acting from that in any manner, whatever manner seems to be fit. And that's all we can judge is by we as Christians can see how we ourselves and our group and our people essentially are doing wrong and being wrong. It doesn't matter to look at anyone else, which obviously is one of the most huge problems, is we only look at just earlier in Matthew 7 is the why are you looking at the speck in your brother's eye and leaving the plank in your own eye? Yeah, so this could go on, this could spiral forever. I just really want to get this idea out there that, and always get it more out there, that if you have sensed and seen and experienced abuses by sensible Christians, by churches, by denominations, by church leadership, that one, you are right. The abuses of power and information and persons are almost certainly happening. Two, church for the most part, especially now, is equally, I don't want to say good, bad, and indifferent people, but every form, demographic, label, personality type, everything else, because Christianity has become such a purely cultural draw, the demographic is the same, inside and out. And then three, to some extent, maybe the demographic is in a sense worse, because of how the structure is such a draw for this kind of clinging to self-righteousness, because of how easy, like morally easy and also morally affirming and righteous the message of the church is and has become. So if you see things that are going wrong, they are wrong. If you get a bad feeling about, group or a place or a Christian or a church or whatever, it probably is bad. But don't use that, just as they're kind of doing, to use this wrong theology as an excuse to stop thinking, to stop trying, to stop growing. Don't use that as your excuse either. Or at least try not to. Find something. And this is why I think any faith system is so important, because you need some kind of external thing to redirect yourself to, aside from just what you're feeling or thinking in the moment. Because then you're just given to whatever your present vice is, and you don't even really have a perspective to compare it to. And, with the kind of contemporary humanism, that's exactly what is happening. Everyone claims this kind of higher level of self-driven righteousness on the one hand, but who knows what even is righteousness if there is no external standard aside from just what people are feeling and doing at any given time. And functionally speaking, that's exactly what's been happening in the church, is that on the one hand, there's supposed to be this Christ at the head, but because we've drawn ourselves so far away from the living God in terms of just an institution, it really is just everyone feeling what's right for themselves and doing it, and then labeling it with Christianity and rightness and righteousness, and then weaponizing it with that label. And yeah, so if things are wrong, they're wrong. You feel like they are, but don't stop there. Keep looking, keep searching, keep introspecting, looking into yourself. What can I do better? Not to say that when you're in a horrible situation and you've been victimized and you've been abused, it's your fault. No, not that at all. And certainly think of what others might have done better as well. But don't wallow in that sense of being wrong, because you'll just sit in it for essentially the rest of your life. The draw of self-pity is so wildly appealing. It's where I used to sit. Always. And find, even if you just have to go outside, right? Find the things that bring light and bring joy and bring hope, and where you can find them and search for them, because this is where God is. Not in the abuse not in the questionable teachings, but in the inherent goodness that you see come from some of the time, that you see in creation. Seek that truth that is transcendent of what you feel, of what simply serves you and your ego and what feels nicer and feels better. This is God. This is God in the world and in the church and in people and in every organization and everywhere that anything is. Where the goodness is, that's where God is. Follow that. Turn yourself to that, and you will find him, and he has found you.